Greetings from CBC Studio A to our tens of listeners from coast to coast, and welcome to another episode of Discernment Digest, where we seek to help you think better about less by applying precepts and principles of God's truth to the affairs of everyday life, and also look at contemporary events from a biblical perspective in an effort to model discernment in how we assess what is happening. In today's episode, I'll mention three events, all of which have alleged or real connections to Israel, but all three of which are in the minds of many, and perhaps in the minds of some Discernment Digest listeners, considered evidence of the power of the Jews to control world events. Now, let me say that again, the power of the Jews to control world events. That is something that has a long and inglorious history over centuries, but the fervor with which it's propagated now is stronger than I've ever seen in my lifetime, at least in our country, and is of increasing concern as it grows in acceptance, including among some in power. For example, it's hard to believe, but New York City elected as its mayor Zoran Mamdani this past November, despite the fact that New York City is known for its large Jewish population, and Mamdani is very pro-Palestinian and thus not fond of Israel. Now, anti-Israel and anti-Semitic are not the same thing, but they often go together, and it's no surprise that in this anti-Israel environment, we also have an increase in antisemitism. Jewish former Democratic Congressman Dan Goldman lost his bid for re-election in November. And he recently stopped in at a Brooklyn coffee shop with his 7-year-old daughter so she could use the bathroom. He had a nice interaction with the barista as he purchased a coffee, and he left a large tip. But after identifying Goldman from security footage, the shop's social media team posted a photo of him, stated they had refunded his money, and they wrote, quote, at Poetica, name of the coffee shop, "We don't serve racists, fascists, homophobes, genocide enablers, or anyone in between." Now, I say it's hard to believe that Mamdani is now the mayor of New York City because, of course, that is where 9/11 happened, and the mastermind of that attack, Osama bin Laden, was himself a pro-Palestinian advocate, and in part because of that anti-Israel approach, frequently citing the so-called Palestinian struggle and specifically the Israeli occupation and the United States backing of Israel. He cited that as a primary justification for his group, Al-Qaeda's actions. In his 1996 declaration of war, and in later messages, he frequently swore to punish the, quote, oppressive Jews and their allies for their actions against Palestinians. And he did that with the 9/11 attack on the Twin Towers in New York City. Mamdani has been asked many times whether Israel has a right to exist, and he said yes, but not in its current form as a Jewish nation. He refused to attend this year's Israel Day parade in New York, marking the first time in over 60 years that that city's mayor skipped the event, citing opposition to the current Israeli government and the conflict in Gaza. While boycotting that event, Mamdani has continued to participate in other cultural celebrations, including the Pakistan Independence Day last year, and yet Pakistan's official religion is Islam. Well, this is quite a contrast to where we were 40 years ago. In 1984, Democratic presidential candidate Jesse Jackson, during the campaign, referred to New York City in what he thought was an off-the-record comment. He referred to it as Jaime Town. Jaime is a Jewish racial slur. It made national headlines, and it cost Jackson politically. So the power balance in New York City has shifted, at least for now, and it'll be something on which we should keep a wary eye. And not just in New York City. Milat Kuris recently won the Democratic nomination to run in November to represent Colorado in the U.S. House of Representatives. She was asked to condemn a man who threw gasoline on a 78-year-old Jewish woman who was in a march demanding the release of hostages, Israeli hostages in Gaza, and she had to give one of those word salads, and she wouldn't say whether it was anti-Semitic, even though the guy who set this elderly woman on fire found out about the location of the march because he was asking around, quote, "Where can I find a bunch of Jews?" So back to the Jews' power to control world events. They've not been able to prevent the election of Mandami. They've lost Jewish congressmen like Goldman, and before him others like longtime Congressman Eliot Engel, who lost his seat in the 2020 election to Jamal Bowman. Bowman served only two-year terms before he was defeated last year, in part because he was too extreme in his anti-Israel stance. He was, as I said, elected to Congress from New York in 2020, along with Mondaire Jones, and the two were largely aligned ideologically, and yet Jones had to part ways with Bowman in the 2024 election because of Israel. Now, remember, on October 7th, 2023, Hamas, based in Gaza, attacked Jews in Israel, leaving more than 1,200 dead. But Jamal Bowman was among the first lawmakers to call for a ceasefire, and he accused Israel of committing genocide in Gaza in its counterattack. And at one point, he cast doubt that Hamas committed sexual violence against Jewish women, calling that claim, quote, propaganda. He did later say he was wrong. Anyway, Mondaire Jones threw his support in that last election to Bowman's opponent, saying, quote, "There's nothing progressive about rushing to call for a ceasefire in the days following October 7, before Israel could even begin to defend itself. And there's nothing progressive about getting endorsed by the Democratic Socialists of America, which in the days following October 7 amplified a pro-Hamas rally in New York City," end quote. So the Israeli-Hamas war that started with the Hamas attack on Israel in October of 2023 has been occasion for much criticism of Hamas, but also by many of Israel. And it's highlighted and brought out the antipathy that many hold toward Israel. And that is just backdrop then to the three issues I want to mention that involve criticism of Israel and the supposed control of events by Jews. The first is our war in Iran, which I've mentioned on this podcast several times because weekly and often daily our government's statements about it have been contradictory, about our having won the war being over, a ceasefire is in effect, announcements that we're attacking again, a much-touted 14-point memorandum of understanding that honestly seemed ridiculous on its face if you read it, parts of which I read on Discernment Digest, and most of which was favorable to Iran, and yet it's not only not been implemented. As I record this, we're attacking Iran yet again, demanding they open the Strait of Hormuz yet again. I don't know how else to describe it other than a disorganized disaster. But Israel has participated with us because they would love to see Iran no longer as the threat to them and really to the entire region. And by the way, the Arab countries around Iran would like to see the same. Remember, Iran is Shia Muslim. The other nations are Sunni Muslim, and so there is internal hostility among Muslims in the Middle East. And yet, if you listen to the likes of Tucker Carlson or Candace Owens, and you should not, Israel is driving the process, and the Jews' control extends to control of the United States government going to war to protect not so much U.S. interests, but Israeli interests. Tucker Carlson claimed that the Jews engineered the war with Iran as a plot to destroy Islamic holy sites and to rebuild the Third Temple. And Candace Owens amplified his claims and alleged that Israel manufactured the pretext for war. She's also characterized Israel's border actions in the region as, quote, demonic. And those two have huge online followings. Well, at least that Israeli Jewish conspiracy does in fact involve Israel, because again, Israel is supportive and involved because, for example, Hezbollah, which is supported by Iran and has a presence in Lebanon to Israel's north, where they menace the Jewish nation, Israel has been asked to refrain from attacks or at times even counterattacks on Hezbollah in the interest of getting a deal with Iran, which again seems elusive at best. But the other issue that supposedly involves the Jews controlling world events is the assassination of Charlie Kirk last September, after which immediately conspiracy theories developed, as they often do in high-profile assassinations or assassination attempts. But these also pointed the finger at Israel, and Tucker and especially Candace have led the way with their dubious, often ridiculous and completely unproven claims. And this past week, that was exposed in the pretrial hearing in the prosecution of Charlie's assassin, Tyler Robinson. In that multi-day hearing, Robinson's attorneys could not offer a defense against the overwhelming evidence that he shot Charlie. The evidence is so clear and overwhelming that I will predict now that he will be convicted at trial as the lone gunman with no one else involved, and certainly not Israel and the Jews. On the morning of Charlie Kirk's killing, Tyler Robinson's roommate and boyfriend said Robinson left their home earlier than usual, around 4 a.m. Robinson showed up 3.5 hours later at Utah Valley University campus in Orem, Utah. And prosecutors played surveillance footage that showed Robinson walking on campus and interacting with representatives from Kirk's Turning Point USA organization that was holding an event there that day. Prosecutors showed video footage of Robinson returning to campus later in different clothes from the ones that he was pictured in earlier, as well as he had changed his gait, the way he was walking. He was holding one leg straight because they believe he was concealing the rifle in his pants as he walked. Surveillance showed him heading to the rooftop of the building from which Charlie Kirk was shot. And surveillance video shows Tyler Robinson rolling over a railing onto the building rooftop, lying prone and later dropping down off of that area. In text between Robinson and his roommate from the night of the shooting, Robinson said he had hidden his grandfather's rifle in bushes near campus, and he returned while an intense manhunt was underway. He texted again saying that, quote, "There's a squad car parked right by it." And he added again, "I'm sorry for roping you into all this. You should not have to worry about this." In the text that his boyfriend/roommate exchanged with him, the boyfriend asked whether he was the shooter, and Robinson admitted it and apologized. He said, quote, "I had enough of his," that would be Kirk's, "hatred. Some hate can't be negotiated out," end quote. Tyler Robinson was not sure what model of gun he used per the text because he used his grandfather's rifle. He said, quote, "I don't fully know what the gun was because it was old and Gramps did some modifying." His roommate is on video testifying that Robinson had asked weeks earlier about using an engraving tool in advance of an upcoming hunting and camping trip with his family. After the shooting, though, Robinson texted the boyfriend saying, quote, "Remember how I was engraving bullets? Those were mostly a big meme. Investigators have pictures of inscribed bullets and cartridges found both at the crime scene and at Robinson's residence with messages like, quote, 'Hey, fascist, catch.'" He eventually gave up trying to retrieve that rifle, he said in a text, and he made his way back to his home. But authorities did discover the rifle, and they found DNA matching Robinson on both the rifle and the towel that it was wrapped in. Now, okay, I remind you of something I've said many times on this podcast, namely that truth claims require proof. Not just evidence or artifacts, but evidence that amounts to proof. And do you see the difference? I've said that literally everything is evidence of something. But to make truth claims, you have to show that the evidence proves what you claim. And this is where Candace and Tucker come in, and where those who believe them go wrong, namely with the "I'm just asking questions" tactic that purports to connect dots, yet without proof. So their statements will often be accompanied by, "Doesn't it seem strange that?" And then you fill in the blank with whatever may have been going on in Charlie's life that they imply may have been a factor. But again, factors and pieces of evidence are not proof. The question is, evidence of what? And then they retreat to the just asking questions refuge. Now, for any of you immersed in the Tucker world and aware of his interview with Joe Kent a couple months ago, I need to at least demonstrate that I'm familiar with who Kent is and what he claims. Joe Kent is the former National Counterterrorism Center director of our government who resigned from his job back in March because he was opposed to going to war with Iran. Well, okay, it's not unusual that someone resigns from an administration due to a difference on policy, but Joe Kent claims more. And in this claim, it relates the two things about which I've talked today, namely the war with Iran and Charlie Kirk's murder, and the alleged involvement of Israel in the latter, Kirk's murder, and here is how. While he resigned due to his opposition to the Iran war, he also says that he was prevented from investigating Charlie Kirk's murder and that FBI officials wanted to, quote, turn everything over to the Utah state authorities. But here's where there is the insinuation of something more sinister at play. Kent says that Charlie Kirk had, quote, looked him in the eye, end quote, in the West Wing of the White House and told him, quote, Joe, stop us from getting into a war with Iran, end quote, and that Charlie was urging the administration to, quote, rethink their relationship with Israel, end quote. Okay, so we have a man who believes in Joe Kent, we have no good reason to go to war with Iran, something which, as I've already said, was favored by and benefits Israel. And he also says that Kirk was opposed, was warning about Israel, and now he's dead. The implication is left that there, with this alleged relationship of dots that could be connected, is quite thinly veiled. But this approach can go both ways, as I'll demonstrate with Joe Kent in a moment. But first, just consider how this is similar to the conspiracies about the JFK assassination, and those have persisted in the over 6 decades since it happened in 1963. Lee Harvey Oswald shot President Kennedy, but why? And was he prompted and helped by others? After all, he called himself a Marxist during the height of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. He had visited the USSR, and he even married a Russian woman, and he was part of a group called Fair Play for Cuba Committee, Cuba being a client state of Russia. So it's possible that the Soviet Secret Service, the KGB, was involved in some way, but after decades of investigations, and now even last year's release of the CIA and FBI Kennedy files, guess what? Nothing that changes what has already been proven. There is no proof of anything different. So possibilities are not proof. And without proof, your dots remain isolated pieces of evidence. Evidence of something like, in Oswald's case, that he favored the communist nations of Russia and Cuba over the United States, but not proof of any coordination between him and them. His favor toward them and his resultant disdain for Cold Warrior John Kennedy were enough motive for him to do what he did without the prodding or the help of others. Now, the dots that Joe Kent and Tucker Carlson hang out there, replete with Tucker's famous furrowed brow of deep thought and concern as his guest drops these explosive nuggets, Those dots are not connected, at least not at this point. And there is one other dot to add to the mix. Joe Kent is reportedly under investigation for releasing classified information. Now, if you want to believe what he and Tucker are putting down, then you might be inclined to say, oh yeah, of course, he's a whistleblower, and now they're trying to discredit him. But here's the thing. The FBI reportedly started that investigation before he resigned. Now, it is possible that some knew that Kent was going to resign, and so they preemptively opened an investigation. But it's also possible that he knew he was under investigation and is implying these dark theories in order to false flag and point in that very direction. I don't know whether either is the case, so I make no claim, which is in keeping with what we do at Discernment Digest. It's part of the mission of this podcast to model and encourage claims that are proven and nothing more. Now, Tucker Carlson is his own piece of work, and I'll talk about him some more in a bit regarding his fascination with yet another conspiracy theory, this one involving a biblical matter of all things. But meanwhile, there is the amazing Ms. Owens, Candace Owens, who's not only claimed Tyler Robinson did not murder Charlie Kirk, saying that Robinson was not even at the scene, but she has claimed that his widow was involved, along with, of course, Israel. Honestly, Candace Owens' bizarre rants about this are so off the rails that I don't want to spend any more time than I have on this issue already. I definitely do not want to waste time on her. I will just say, given all that came out in the pre-trial hearing, when the trial begins and when it is over, and with, as I am confident will happen, a conviction of Tyler Robinson, just watch what Candace Owens does in order to cover for all of the things that she has said that are so outlandish and wrong. I will just say, dear listeners, if you're Tucker or if you're Candace listeners, reconsider in the name of discernment. Discernment not only involves how we process information, but from whom we choose to get it. Before you ever fill your mind with claims, you first exercise discernment in the choice of who you allow to do that. You're listening to this podcast because you've chosen, wisely I think, to allow me to speak to you and frame issues in an accurate manner. Of course, I can make factual mistakes. Try, though I do, to fact check all that I say. And if I do make a factual mistake, please tell me about it using the email that I'll give at the end. But facts are pretty easy these days, especially in the information age. What's more difficult is relating the facts that requires wisdom. Wisdom is the application of knowledge, the application of information. And that is where we all need to choose well. And why the motto of this podcast is, again, think better about less. I strongly recommend you remove Tucker and Candace as sources, shrinking your less category, indeed, for the better. Now, the third and final issue related to the power of the Jews to control world events, again, involves Tucker and a guest he had on exactly 3 weeks ago, a man named J.D. Hall, who's a former and disgraced pastor who has an arrest record. He settled out of court with his former church to repay money that they say he embezzled. He was addicted to prescription drugs. And for years, he wrote a religious scandal rag called Pulpit and Pen. When I say scandal rag, it just means he was finding dirt on churches and ministries, and he was publishing it all the time. Ironically, then later had all these problems himself. And he revived that under another name after all of his troubles. The new name is Protestia. And last year, he had a dispute with them, and he's now started his own pay Substack called Insight to Incite. Insight, I-N-S-I-G-H-T, to Incite, I-N-C-I-T-E. And he does incite. I'll give him that, but as for the insight, I-N-S-I-G-H-T, not so much. Somehow he gets a spot on Tucker's show. Now, the somehow has to do with their shared anti-Semitism. Tucker called him a theologian, and J.D. didn't correct him, but let's just say that's quite an exaggeration. In fact, when called out on it, J.D. defended allowing that to stand by saying that he has for years said that everyone's a theologian. Well, there's a sense in which that's true, but in the sense of one who's mastered a discipline, as Tucker was using it, and no doubt the way all of his listeners heard it, he most certainly is not a theologian. And if we're just using theologian in the pedestrian sense that everyone has thoughts about God, then no need to apply the title at all, since it does not distinguish you from anyone else. Anyway, theologian J.D. Hall, asked by Tucker to come on and explain the place of Israel in the Bible's unfolding story and God's redemptive history, and also how, now wait for it, dispensationalism, C.I. Scofield in the Scofield Reference Bible, the British Oxford Press, and of course the Jews foisted this brand new theology, dispensationalism, on the world for the express purpose of propagating Zionism, a homeland for the Jews in what J.D. calls Palestine. Now, I'm not done for today quite yet, but I want to say at this point that in the next episode or the one after, I'll deal with the truth about dispensationalism and contrast it with its opposite, covenant theology. So please listen to the next couple of episodes if you're interested in that. For now, regarding his horrible interview and false claims by J.D. Hall, I'll make several points in staccato fashion, but I refer you to a 90-minute breakdown of this interview by a true theologian and scholar, Dr. Peter Gaiman, that's spelled G-O-E-M-A-N, Peter Gaiman, of Shepherd Seminary in Cary, North Carolina, and he uses several clips from the Tucker Hall interview and then corrects the many misstatements. You can find that podcast at Peter Gaiman's website, petergaiman.com, Peter, G-O-E-M-A-N.com. Here are some of the false claims made by J.D. Hall in that interview. One is that a man named John Nelson Darby invented dispensationalism out of whole cloth in about 200 years ago. But the truth is, every doctrine that Darby taught had been taught by someone in church history prior to him. Now, he did systematize dispensationalism by bringing several truths together, but that's the same thing that happened with covenant theology. It, too, had a systematizer who I'll mention in the next week or two, and he did his work after the Reformation. The famous and great real theologian Cornelius Van Til of Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, that's one of my alma maters. In fact, I took all of my classes there in Van Til Hall. Van Til said this, quote, "The idea of covenant theology has only in modern times been broadly conceived." Van Til and all of Westminster believe covenant theology, and yet he said that. J.D. Hall made a bunch of false claims that Gaiman calls out, but the most fantastical of those is the conspiracy of C.I. Scofield and the Oxford Press and the British government to foist dispensationalism and thus Zionism, that is, the desire for a Jewish homeland, on Britain and the United States especially, but also on the whole world. So I'm going to go through a little bit of what Tucker said and J.D. said and some of what Gaiman says to correct. But I encourage you, if you can, if you're interested in this, then listen to Gaiman's whole podcast on his site. Tucker says, now, with this, you said novel theology, cultish theology, non-traditional Christian theology. He's talking about dispensationalism, but it's disseminated effectively by this guy Scofield. Now, who is C.I. Scofield and his reference Bible? Let me just stop there for a moment. But the Scofield Reference Bible came out about 120 years ago, a little less than 120 years ago, as we will see. And it was wildly popular. When I was young, when I was a teenager, many people in the evangelical world owned the Scofield Reference Bible. And that Scofield Reference Bible, Scofield Study Bible, had study notes in it. Study Bibles are something many of our listeners would be familiar with. You have now, these days, the MacArthur Study Bible, the Ryrie Study Bible. the NIV Study Bible, the Geneva Study Bible, Reformation Study Bible, and so on. But Scofield's was just wildly, wildly popular and influenced generations with regard to their understanding of how the Bible story is put together. So that's why Scofield is so important, and because his notes taught dispensationalism. So JD says to Tucker, yeah, Scofield's name is on it. Tucker says, his name's on it? JD says, yeah. Well, what was his motive, says Tucker? Do we know? JD says, I don't think Scofield's motive is sinister. I don't mean to throw him under the bus like he's a bad guy or a villain. I do think it was weird that he didn't think to himself, okay, so I'm a relative nobody. Why are strangers paying to sail me across the ocean to meet with people I don't know? All right, so J.D. Hall says that C.I. Scofield had strangers, people he doesn't know, pay for him to sail across the ocean to come from England to America. And Carlson says, at Oxford, you say strangers did pay his way across? And JD's answer is, there's nothing in Scofield's life that would suggest that he would have had the funds to pay that for himself. All right, let me stop there. He's got no proof that anyone paid to have him come to the United States, just his conjecture that Scofield would have had no way to pay himself, so therefore, some of these people had to do it. JD says there's a couple of things that don't make a lot of sense, including the club that he was part of in New York with the, dues that would not be reasonable to presume someone of Scofield's lack of employment would be able to afford. So yeah, he goes across the ocean and he meets with high society. I mean, it's Oxford, right? Peter Gaiman comes in on his podcast. He says, this is Psychology 101. We're having psychology class here. It is insinuation. There are no facts. There's nothing that would say strangers paid his way across the ocean. We know that Scofield had at least 4 wealthy donors that backed him. They're not strangers. Hall doesn't even mention them, but I, Gaiman says, have written a blog article about it. But it's Alwyn Ball, Jr. of New York, John T. Perry of Chicago, John Buss of St. Louis, and Francis Fitch of New York. And he goes on, the implication is it's Jewish dark money that's coming in. The Jews are trying to really get the Scofield Bible funded so that Zionism can be propagated. That's really the whole point, says Gaiman. Not to mention that Darby is the one that they're saying his ideas launched this, and then Scofield is the one who's propagating it, but Darby comes well before Zionism in the mid-1800s. And so if you're putting these things together, the facts just don't relate to the spin that's going on here. But alas, says Gaiman, objectivity and the search for truth are not important to some people. And he says, let's continue on here about Oxford Press, and then he plays another clip from the Tucker Hall interview. Here's J.D. Hall, and they discussed putting the Bible into print, and it was the first Bible of its kind in which the marginal notes are going to have, theological content. Tucker says, so built in. Peter Gaiman jumps in, okay, so that's incorrect. Obviously, it's not the first study Bible. The 1560 Geneva Bible was the first study Bible. All right, back to J.D. Hall. Yeah, it's built in to the study Bible, which was totally new. So if you couldn't go to seminary, it's okay. You just buy Scofield's Bible and believe what's within its pages. Tucker says, so it sounds like you're suggesting that he was himself, knowingly or not, kind of an operator. And J.D. Hall says, I think he was a patsy. Yeah, I think that the Zionists in the United Kingdom, the political scientists, Zionists, got wind of what Darby's people were teaching, and they thought, well, at the same time, you've got Theodor Herzl, who's trying to get Europe to buy into the Zionist project, and this eschatology is growing over here, which could be helpful to their cause. And yeah, they disseminated the Bible, that Scofield Bible, I think for clearly political reasons. Peter Gaiman, well, this is draining on my soul. If we're in a court of law, the lawyers would say conjecture, and the judge would say sustained. J.D. Hall's insinuating a bunch of things without evidence here. And one of the biggest things is that this was a big psyop, a psychological operation. The Oxford University Press had no motivation politically to gain here. The truth is, everybody acknowledges that the Scofield Reference Bible did amazing with regard to sales. Oxford Press is a business, and they made money on it. It's entirely possible, I would say even probable, that those at Oxford University Press were able to read society and say there's a market for this kind of book, so let's publish it and let's make money. Back to Tucker Carlson. So this came from the UK, the United Kingdom. Zionism is an idea really kind of gathered steam first in the UK, in England. Why? Any idea? JD says, JD Hall, I don't know why. Zionism, religious Zionism, took off in England organically. Now, I mean, that's where the Plymouth Brethren, that's Darby's denomination, moved to, so that would make sense. But I would point out, says J.D. Hall, that the same institution that printed the Scofield Bible is the same institution that published the Balfour Declaration within a year. Tucker says, yeah? So it's practically the same people, says J.D. So within a year of the Balfour Declaration, you have this, hey, coincidentally, this really great new theology that helps support and back up the political ambition of the Zionists. Peter Gaiman says, okay, I just get tired of this. So all of these are conjectures, no evidence, but it's a psyop. He literally claims that the Balfour Declaration and the Scofield Reference Bible are published by the same organization. Well, the Balfour Declaration was put out by Arthur Balfour on behalf of the British cabinet. So it was a foreign office document, not from Oxford University Press or anything like that. It was the British government essentially announcing its support for establishing a national home for the Jewish people in the land of Palestine. And Oxford University Press is completely separate from the British government. And he said it's within a year. So he's making it sound like it was boom, boom, just one after the other. Well, the Scofield Reference Bible is published in 1909. The Balfour Declaration is in 1917. Anyway, says Gaiman, we see how Tucker is aiding J.D. Hall in trying to come up with a certain narrative. So, yeah, all I can say, says Gaiman, is he's far from being an expert. Well, that's enough for today. If you have any questions or comments, you can send those to discern@cbctrenton.com. I hope you can listen again next Monday. In the meantime, have a great week serving and discerning.